It's weakening his power base when it comes to the relationship that he's building up with the international community, that he's relying on for A, business, and B, military material supports, so with China, with Iran, with North Korea and elsewhere. And China will be sort of sitting there, Xi Jinping will have his eyebrows raised going, okay, are my investments in Russia by supporting them tacitly, are they safe? What do I need to do? So it'll be reducing confidence in that and confidence across the BRICS community that Russia's part of.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine and Ukraine's ongoing incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. And I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, former Colonel Philip Ingram, MBE, a former military intelligence officer with more than 26 years of experience in the UK Armed Forces and a former NATO planner. He's now a respected military analyst and commentator. Philip, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good to be back, James.
Well, here we are over a week in now to Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. What is your assessment of how it's going?
Yeah, I think it's slightly more than an incursion. I think I'd almost refer to it as a mini invasion, and I think it's going exceptionally well. It's caught the Russians on the back foot. It's clear that there wasn't a strong military presence there, but the border guards are down to the FSB, the Russian security services, and they've been caught on the hop as well. So it's embarrassed Putin. It's embarrassed their security commanders, it's embarrassed their military commanders. It's sending a clear message to the Russians because they can't keep this quiet. It's in Russia as well. And it's given a morale boost to the Ukrainians.
We'll come on to for how long Ukraine can hold on to the territory it's captured in a moment, because that is one of the key questions currently. Yeah. What do you think the main objective of the incursion or invasion, call it what you will, is from a Ukrainian standpoint?
This is difficult. The Ukrainians have planned this and built it up with a lot of secrecy around it, which is exactly what they should be doing. It's the only way that they're going to achieve success. And we don't know what their final objective is. We don't know what, in military planning terms, you'd call their limit of exploitation is. So we don't know how far they're going to go. They will be restricted by the number of troops that they can put into the area, the logistic lines that they've got and resupply that's in there, because if they start to overstretch themselves and put themselves too thinly on the ground, then they're very vulnerable. And the Russians will notice that, and the Russians will exploit that, and that could be very costly to the Ukrainians. I think they've already achieved their objectives. The objectives are, I think, There are multiple ones. One, it's sending a clear message to the international community that the invasion of Russia, which was a Putin's red line, has been crossed, and Putin hasn't been able to do anything about it. So there's no reason why the international community should not remove the restrictions on using longer-range weapons to attack areas where the Russians are launching attacks into Ukraine. That's what they've been after the whole way through. It's sending a message to Putin. We can think out the box and we can come and take the fight to you. You're not dictating the terms. So they've wrestled the initiative back again. And it's sending that message out to the Russian people as well, because there are now refugees coming from the Kursk region and other regions close to it that are heading up towards Moscow. And it's in the Russian press, and it's causing commentators to sort of question Vladimir Putin. It's weakening his position. It's putting a big morale shot into the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian military, who have been fighting hard in the east and being pushed back slowly. But now there's this big boost that's going in there, and that can only help. And then there's the military implications. What it's doing is it's forcing the Russians to have to take some of the reserve forces that were sitting in the east if they were needed, and potentially some of the forces that were engaged in the east or up in the Kharkiv attack that they put in, and move them around to try and deal with this. But they're coming in ad hoc groups. That's never a good way to approach this sort of thing. So the Ukrainians are sitting there smiling at the moment, and I think they've achieved the main things that they need to achieve. What else they're going to do, how long they're going to stay, if they're going to stay, I don't know.
I suppose also having a foothold inside Russian territory means that drone strikes can hit deeper into Russia and hit Russian military targets.
Well, it can give drone strikes deeper into Russia. Now, the Ukrainians are having some success at getting their drones, thousands of kilometers into Russia without the Russians identifying them. But it also is allowing the Ukrainians to push their air defenses up into these areas, and therefore that is pushing the Russian aircraft further back. because there's the great danger of them being shot down. And it's also panicking the Russian defense forces and those air defense forces that are hastily moving in. And we've seen how when Russian air defense forces panic in Crimea in particular, they tend to shoot their own aircraft down. And this is where I see this as a complete masterstroke by the Ukrainians, almost certainly planned by my favourite general in the Ukrainian military, General Banov, who heads their military intelligence organisation.
Yeah, just talk a bit more about General Banov, because I know you're a big fan of him and his strategic decisions. Just talk us through some of the key ones he's made already in this war.
Well, he's the big one that hasn't really been talked about a lot is he's brought in Second World War type special operations executive operations across Russia and across occupied Ukraine. So those are the factories that produce military kits suddenly catching fire. It's the drones being fired at airfields across Russia. It's the drones flying into oil refineries and elsewhere. It's the attack in the Kursk bridge. It's the attack on logistic dumps and commando raids into Crimea. It's the way that the Ukrainians have dealt with the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And not having a navy, but they've managed to sink over a third of it and put out of action almost half of it and push the rest of the navy scared off into Russian ports. And they have been able to affect what is the international grain and food resupplies going in out of Ukraine in the way the Russians had said they wanted to. So it's all taking pressure off. And he's thinking outside the box. He's bringing in all of these different operations. And he almost certainly masterminded the couple of raids that went into the Belgorod region of Russia last year by the Russian Legion. Those are ethnic Russians who are loyal to Ukraine and are fighting for Ukraine, and they have their own little formation. And of course, they say they weren't under the command of the Ukrainian military, but General Banov would probably say that he's military, but he's not military because he heads their national intelligence, military intelligence organization, and then he would have been behind this, but he will have been key in planning it. But this is probably the first time we've seen him linking in with the Ukrainian regular troops. So this is General Syrsky's first big push. And boy, is it success from what we've seen so far. It could turn very bad if they're not careful.
Well, let's come on to that. What are
so
the risks here for Ukraine?
Yeah, the biggest risk is if they overstretch themselves, and the Russians manage to then be able to concentrate their force and somehow or other attack in and have a massive effect against what seems to be, from the reporting I'm seeing, are Ukraine's better troops that they're using in this. And if they get attacked by the Russians, that could have a longer term impact on Ukraine's ability to maintain the initiative they've now got back. So they have to watch that very closely. But what they've done is not something that they've done on the spur of the moment. It'll have taken months and months and months of planning. It'll have taken months of getting all the troops in the right place and making sure that they've got all the right equipment, ammunition and everything else, match that against the threat. They'll have had probing operations going in with special forces to check on everything. And there's lots of reports that their special forces are leading into the different areas and they're probing to find the boundaries between different formations or different groupings, exploiting that. Then the regular Ukrainian troops are moving up to deal with it. And we're seeing them using some of the better Western equipment as they go in. So it's the biggest threat is that overstretch and the Russians getting to a position where they can destroy too much of Ukraine's greater capability. But the Ukrainians will know that, so they'll have a plan in place.
I mean, it appears like the pace of the Ukrainian advance has slowed in recent days, and that in a way makes sense because you'd expect them now to try and consolidate the land they've taken as opposed to push on into Russia further.
There's three things that I think they can do. The first one is consolidate on the land that they've taken and try and defend that. Now, it's quite a big area. It's over 1,000 square kilometres. Hugely more than the Russians have taken in the last couple of years. But to do that, to hold that properly, if the Russians manage to get good formations in, is going to be really difficult indeed. So I think the other option could be that what they'll do is they'll withdraw back to hold some of the territory. It still gives them a negotiating stance. It still gives them that message to Putin. And we have to remember Kursk region is quite interesting. There's a good percentage of the population there are what you could describe almost as ethnic Ukrainians. The Ukrainian is their first language. They speak that, and it would give President Zelensky a legitimacy if he said, "I'm looking after my people," in the same way the Russians said that about Eastern Ukraine with the ethnic Russian speakers, and that would be a bit of a words play and playing off Putin with his own words. Or the other thing that they could do is they could withdraw completely. And come back into Ukrainian territory and then send the clear message out to the international community that we don't want to capture Russian territory. We want to show Putin that we can invade if we need to. We can therefore go in and take some to negotiate if you want to do territory swap, and we can take more than you can take, and we'll quite happily do that then. But it's saying to the international community, we don't want to do this. We just want to be able to defend our country, and therefore please take the restrictions off the use of the weapons that you're supplying, so we can have a proper military effect on that. It wouldn't surprise me if they do that, because they haven't lost many troops and stuff at the moment. From again the anecdotal reporting is all we're getting out from it. It's too early to tell which option they're going to take.
Has it surprised you, the Russian response, and that they haven't been able to push back the Ukrainians more up to this point?
Yes and no. Yes, because I expected the Russians to have had proper defences close to their borders, especially after the Belgorod raids, and have mobile reserves in a position where as soon as they get an indication of something happening, they can move that mobile reserve in to try and stabilise it and hold any invasion force back. That doesn't seem to exist. And what that suggests to me is that the Russians are in a much worse position than we have been estimating when it comes to their military capability, the formations that they've got to hand, the equipment that they've got access to, their weapons and ammunition and equipment. And that reflects on the Russians having to go to North Korea to get troops, North Korea to get ammunition, North Korea to get pieces of equipment, to Iran to get missiles and drones and all the rest of it. So it's just reinforcing that, but it's suggesting they're in an even worse position than they are. And Putin seems to be not responding in a direct way, and seems to be floundering a little bit. He hasn't come out with a clear plan and articulated it. He seems to be sticking his head in the sand a little bit, which again surprises me that he hasn't taken charge and is suggesting that he doesn't know what way to turn. He doesn't know. He's been completely dislocated by the Ukrainian action, and it's caught him off guard and caught his inner circle off guard. I think we'll start to see once the Russians have managed to stop the Ukrainians from advancing, or the Ukrainians decide to stop advancing, I think we'll see Putin starting to take some harsher actions, to try and push the Ukrainians back, but harsher actions in Moscow against those that he will have perceived as failing to protect his homeland.
We'll come on to Putin in just a moment. Do you think it is feasible, Philip, that we may see further raids, incursions by the Ukrainians across different parts of the Russian border?
I don't see it as impossible. The trouble is now they've done it, so the Russians are going to be going, where are they going to do it next? So you only get to try and create a surprise once. Now the Ukrainians have clearly probed. They probed in the Belgorod region a couple of times. That would have been sending a message potentially to the Russians that if the Ukrainians are going to do that, they're going to do that there. So they might have put some more defensive capability there, and then you go in somewhere else. I don't think the Russians are very good at learning lessons and learning very quickly. So I think they could do it again. There's nothing to stop them doing it again. But this is the one time for them to have that true success, because surprise is critical to it.
Vladimir Putin, let's come on to him and his position. Is this the biggest threat to his power since the attempted mutiny led by Yevgeny Prigozhin last year?
Well, I don't see it as an immediate threat to his power, but what it's doing is it's weakening his power base. There isn't a natural successor that's coming in. We're not hearing noises from anyone that's trying to push him out. But what it's doing is it's weakening his power base within the oligarchs that are keeping him in place. So it wouldn't surprise me if there are little conversations going on behind closed doors going, right, how do we get him out and who's next to take over, and all of the some form of internal coup. It's weakening his power base when it comes to the relationship that he's building up with the international community, that he's relying on for A, business, and B, military material supports with China, with Iran, with North Korea and elsewhere. And China will be sort of sitting there, Xi Jinping will have his eyebrows raised going, okay, are my investments in Russia by supporting them tacitly, are they safe? What do I need to do? So it'll be reducing confidence in that and confidence across the BRICS community that Russia's part of. And it's also raising doubts amongst the Russian people. The war has come into Russia, and the Russian people have been trying to put it out of their minds, going, no, this is somewhere else. This is Ukraine. Ukraine's brought it on themselves. We're trying to protect the poor Ukrainian people from these nasty NATO people that are clearly influencing them. But it's happening in Ukraine. It's not happening in Russia. Now it's happening in Russia. So we live in interesting times, I think.
It also undermines Putin's brand that he tries to put about, which is that he is a winner. I was speaking the other day on Frontline to George Grills, the Times' defence correspondent. He was making the point Putin won't even go to visit the site of a flood in Russia or a terrorist atrocity because it's associating himself with a disaster, with a tragedy, and he wants to be seen purely as a man who brings success and who brings victory. And until now, you could argue that Russia under Putin was more feared than at any point since the end of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. But now he's the person who's presided over the largest invasion of Russian territory since the Second World War. That is a massive failure.
Oh, it is a massive failure. And it's the only invasion by a non-nuclear nation against a nuclear nation ever. And he has lost the ability to properly control the press and the messaging that's going out across Russia. So, it's put a big crack in that level of control. And with everything, it's all about getting cracks into different things and then exploiting those and trying to wiggle them and make them into fissures and make them bigger. The Ukrainians will be trying to do that as much as they possibly can. So it wouldn't surprise me if this is phase one of a number of different phases of other activities that they're going to deal with. So, if I were the Ukrainians, I'd consolidate somewhere in what I've got there. I'd then switch very quickly to Crimea and take the Kursk bridge out again. Destroy that and start to put pressure on Crimea. You do that, then the political pressure and the military pressure that would be on Putin would be magnified to the next order. I can't see the Ukrainians have you doing this in isolation. There is more to come, an awful lot more to come, and that'll be fascinating to watch.
Is one of the most significant things to come out of this, Philip, the fact that the long-standing fear that Ukraine's Western allies have had that if you take the fight too directly to Russia, either through long-range strikes or indeed through an incursion, an invasion, such as what we've seen from Ukraine in the past week, you risk escalation to the extent that potentially Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons. Now, we don't want to be complacent. Anything could happen. A cornered man is a dangerous man.
Yeah.
But it looks as if those threats from Putin are pretty empty as things stand.
Well, every red line that Putin has put out there has been crossed. He put a red line out about Western equipment coming in, about Western tanks being supplied, about Western missiles being used, about Western aircraft being delivered. Every time that red line's been out there, the West has gone, we have to be really careful. And then we cross the red line and all of a sudden they go, he hasn't done anything. So that opens the not quite the floodgates, but it opens the gates to supply the Ukrainians a little bit more of what they need. This is another red line that's been crossed. And Putin could use a tactical nuclear weapon. There's no talk about that. And interestingly, he hasn't come out with a lot of nuclear rhetoric. And therefore, I think he's a long way off doing that, because if he does that, he knows that he will instantly lose the support of those countries that he's relying on, because they could not afford to be associated with sanctioning the positive use of a nuclear weapon in any shape or form. So China couldn't afford the sanctions that would then potentially come in from the West if they continue to support Russia. Iran is sanctioned enough at the moment, but they're focused on other bits and pieces. So that would be his weapon of last resort. And if he did use it, he would probably drop one and a small tactical weapon somewhere inside Russia's borders or into the Black Sea as a message to say, it would be a test he'd put it out as, but under the table would say the next one will be Kyiv. Let's negotiate. I don't think he's anywhere near that at the moment.
What have you made of the Western response so far? It was interesting. President Biden said yesterday, I believe, that he's been in constant contact with Kyiv over the past week. The White House has stressed they weren't involved in the planning of this operation. And, I mean, the UK has come out and said that it's okay for Ukraine to use British-supplied weapons on this operation in Russia, but not long-range missiles. What have you made of the response?
There's a mixed response going through, and as anything as it comes out, you will see differentials, and people will try and exploit those differentials. The use of UK weapons inside Russia and others, every country has to, strictly speaking, authorise where the weapons that they supply can be used. So we've seen American weapons used, we've seen British weapons used, or vehicles and all the rest of it. So they will have tacitly said that's not a problem. The UK has been supplying weapons that have been used to attack Russian targets in Russia for months and months and months. The reason why some of the longer range weapons, and in particular when we're talking the UK, it's the Storm Shadow or the French version, which is the Scalp, being used, is not all of the components in it are 100% British. So we get some of them from France, and there'll probably be other countries in there. Every country has to agree to its use whenever you do your export license, and authorise where it can be used and where it can't be. And therefore it's trying to get permission from all of the different countries. And I think France is a sticking point in this. And we've got the political difficulties that are going on. Your domestic politics influences what's happening. US weapons, domestic politics is influencing, as we've seen the whole way through, how US weapons are being used or when money's being made available and all the rest of it. The UK has had this reputation of leading the way. We were the first to supply main battle tanks. We only supplied 14, but it wasn't the tanks that are going to make the difference. It was getting over that political red line and enabling other countries to suddenly go, oh, nothing's happened there. Therefore, we can do the same. And that, I think, is what's happening with the UK now, publicly saying we can use, or the Ukrainians can use British equipment and British weapons inside Russia. And it's giving that sort of political top cover. We're the first, so none of the other countries are going to be embarrassed by being the first and potentially causing themselves greater domestic political issues. It's complicated when the politics gets into it.
A lot of people have speculated this is designed to strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position in the event of future peace talks. I think Putin himself said that the other day. But to me, it also seems like it's sending a message to Ukraine's Western allies, which is, look, if you back us, we can win this. Yeah. And Russia is not as powerful as some people fear. Yeah.
Oh, 100%. You know, I think it's too early for it to be something, unless Ukrainians dig in and hold the territory and have got a clear plan as to when the negotiations are going to be. I think we're at least 12, more likely 24, and more likely more than that months off getting into a position where you could get some form of negotiated settlement. And a negotiated settlement would have to see Putin withdrawing from the internationally recognised borders of Ukraine, including Crimea. He's not in that position himself to even think about that at the moment. But he could easily be forced into it if there's more territory taken or it's held for longer periods of time. But that will take time. And it is sending that clear message out to the rest of the international community. You know, we've done this now. You know, we're in this position. Give us the wherewithal. But again, when it comes to giving the wherewithal, you know, whenever Russia carried out its re-invasion February 2.5 years ago, everyone was saying just give them as many tanks and give them as many aircraft as they need, and they'll go and win this. If we'd done that at that time, they'd have lost a lot of them, and they'd be losing the war even more than people are trying to suggest they're doing at the moment. They're not losing. The Ukrainians are doing a fantastic job, and I'd argue that they are winning, but it is a long, slow process because they need to understand how to not just operate the pieces of equipment, but to fight the pieces of equipment, and not just to fight the pieces of equipment, you know, as a tank or an armoured personnel carrier or an infantry fighting vehicle or an artillery piece or an F-16 aircraft. They need to learn how to fight them all together. You know, if you're putting a British Army formation who's training all of the time through to be able to do that at brigade level, it's a 2-year cycle. You know, and we're expecting the Ukrainians not just to do that, but to do it with equipment that they have not used beforehand. That's going to change the whole doctrine in the way they do things. You know, a Ukrainian Soviet tank had a crew of 3, a Western tank's got a crew of 4. You're changing dynamics down at small team level and expecting that to then grow up to formation level as you're working together. And doing it in contact whilst they're fighting a high-intensity war with, you know, arguably on paper was, you know, supposed to be the second most capable military in the world. You know, what the Ukrainians are doing is phenomenal, and we couldn't do it.
And how transformative an effect will it have on Ukrainian morale, which is always a difficult thing to measure and to kind of work out how significant it is in terms of operations on the ground. But clearly, you know, a lot of, you know, great reporters from the West, including from the Times, have been out in Ukraine over recent weeks and months speaking to Ukrainian troops. And before this incursion, there was a general sense that they were tired. A lot of the troops had been on the front line for too long. They hadn't had enough rest. And there was a sense that because Russia were making incremental gains in the east, that maybe they were on the back foot. This must have fundamentally changed the way Ukrainian troops and Ukrainian people are thinking about the war.
Oh, very much so. And once morale starts to go down, it's very difficult to stop it from going down. And you know, the pressure that the Ukrainian troops have been under in the east has been phenomenal. You know, the fact that the counteroffensive started last year didn't achieve the same sort of territorial gains as had happened whenever the Ukrainians retook Kherson territory down around there, and then Kharkiv, or Kharkiv before Kherson, and the way that was being pushed out through international commentators as a failure. And then, you know, the Ukrainians, the fight for Bakhmut, and they stopped. Then the Ukrainians started to advance a little bit, but then they didn't have the equipment, the wherewithal. The Russians changed their tactics, used glide bombs, which are horrendous whenever they go into trench positions, and started to push the Ukrainians back slowly. Morale was going down. Morale will go down anywhere. This will have changed that completely. You know, people on the front line who are still fighting in the east, who've got nothing to do with what's going on up in the Kursk region and all the rest of it, who will have been tired and starting to give up almost before the raid went in, will now be sitting there buoyed up and going, oh, wow, we can do this. So it's giving them that moral component of their fighting power back again, that spirit back again, which, you know, I've experienced that in different operations. And it's amazing how, you know, a little thing can change that and how much difference that makes to your application of what you're doing in the front line. And this is why I'm pretty certain this is phase one of a number of things that the Ukrainians are doing. They need to exploit this success. They need to exploit the impact that it's having on their troops and the morale it's having on the Ukrainian people as well, because they're getting tired.
When the history books are written about the war in Ukraine, the events of the past week are also going to take up a pretty big chapter.
Oh, very much so. You know, this is something that is going to be studied in staff colleges across the world as they prepare their senior military leaders for decades to come. You know, the history is being written at the minute, a military history in a way that you know, I still refer to Sun Tzu, who is a great Chinese 6th century general and philosopher. I think we'll still be referring to Banov in a similar time period.
Philip Ingram, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.